Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Tenby, where I'm going to be talking today a little bit about entrepreneurship and how important it is for not just our teaching, not just ourselves, but actually for everybody. These are the famous 5 arches here at Tenby. In case you're wondering, this is where I live. I haven't come here on holiday. Now, these walls were all put up for a very good reason, and that is Tenby has always been entrepreneurial. At the moment, if I turn around, you can see the confluence, Frog Street over there, Fetchy's Chip Shop just around the corner. Lots of these places you'll know. You'll have walked along here as a child or with children or with family. Here's Fetchy's ice cream parlour behind me. Lots of pigeons and seagulls. But one thing you'll notice is there are no people. You'll notice one of the most important buildings here on Tenby Tudor Square is that one. It's a church. One of the things that you can understand about medieval towns by looking at their churches isn't really to do with architecture. It's not to do with the perception of the perpendicular or Romanesque arch. You don't even have to go inside them. You just have to do one very, very simple thing. You need to look at the church and decide, is it a small one or is it a big one? Tenby's church is so big because the market in Tenby was big. And the market in Tenby was big because of trade through this place. A lot of you will recognise this picture postcard, harbour here at Tenby, which since the Middle Ages imported wine and goods from the Mediterranean and the West Country in particular, and exported cloth, wool, iron, coal from here. Tenby, its big church, was built on big trade down here. Entrepreneurship has always been with us, and the people in this harbour were and still are entrepreneurs. You had legitimate trade, and you also had illegitimate trade. Pirates. Bartholomew Roberts, for example, the 17th century pirate, terrorised the Caribbean, came from Pembrokeshire. Many pirates did that, and many pirates were involved with smuggling here on the far west coast of Wales. Brandy, tobacco was being landed on the beaches of Pembrokeshire, not far from here. Just as today, cocaine and other drugs are brought in to little tiny coves around the place. So the idea that entrepreneurship is all a good thing is not true. It never has been true. The relationship between the individual and the idea of entrepreneurship is a kind of moral one, something that we all have to work out what our individual relationship with it is. Are we good entrepreneurs or are we pirates? Behind us here is one of Tenby's most important buildings. It's not as big as the church, but it's a very big house, and that's what it is. It's called the Tudor Merchants' House, and this little block that I'm in now is a piece, if you like, of 16th century architecture that has survived. It's quite important. It's walking past Plantagenet House restaurant. Some of you might know that place, might well have eaten there. I've eaten there a few times myself, and when I was about the same age as our students, I used to work behind that window up there, doing the washing up. Now, at the time, working in the Tudor Merchants' House, serving at the chili con carnes, lasagnas, and things like that, because we're talking about the early 80s, possibly even the late 70s. Can you believe it? Nowadays, I would have been probably in Nando's or somewhere else doing a very similar thing. And I think that in the teaching of entrepreneurship, we have to remember some very basic things. because this is a creative process. And when people approach us with their creative ideas, I think we should promise ourselves never to say it can't be done, always to promise ourselves to try to work out how to make it happen. After the successful period of the Tudor regime, this little harbour went very quiet. Perhaps that's because it really was too small to compete in the modern world. The buildings that we see behind us here, created during the late Georgian and Victorian periods, represent the next period of Tenby's success. But I'm standing here on Castle Hill behind a monument. It's the Welsh monument to a German prince, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, who died in 1861. Albert Dda was responsible for one of the most important mercantile events in British history, the Great Exhibition of 1851. That exhibition made people think, and it was during the second part of the 19th century, that most of the systems that we use in our trade and that we rely on, the intellectual property system, the transport system, in the 1860s, in the decade that Prince Albert died, Tenby Railway Station opened. So all of the buildings that we're looking at here now were constructed in response to that. That is apart from the church, standing there in the middle, as a monument to God, but as a reflection of markets here. Because I want to focus in particular on one man in the 18th century. He was born in 1680, around about, and he died, we think, in 1734. His name was Richard Cantillon, or Cantillon. I think it's Richard Cantillon, because I got a feeling that's how they would have pronounced it in Kerry, where he came from. This is what he said when he coined the term entrepreneur. The circulation and exchange of goods and merchandise, as well as their production, are carried on in Europe by entrepreneurs at risk. Cantillon created the word entrepreneur, but discovered its meaning. That's possibly because he himself was a consummate entrepreneur. He lived in Paris, he lived in London, he was important in funding many of the European wars that occurred at the beginning of the 18th century, and he represents, I suppose, a different way of thinking about the way markets and life work. For Cantillon, everybody was an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is a politically charged term that is interpreted in different ways by different people in different cultures at different times. And we should not look at entrepreneurship and the teaching of entrepreneurship as simply the adoption of a behaviour in order to achieve better results. It's much more complicated than that, and much more interesting than that too. In the 19th century, as economists and historians began to perhaps grapple with these big ideas coming from science, they began to create some big ideas of their own. Now, Marx, for example, suggested that underneath Cantillon's idea of the entrepreneur was something more sinister, a historical process of exploitation, with power moving from kings and queens to businesses. And what Marx thought might happen is that the proletariat eventually might revolt against this system. Now, as some of us can remember, an experiment was carried out in the Soviet Union in which Marxism was put to the test. And in many ways now, that experiment is regarded as a failure. That, by the way, is my flat over there in this Soviet bloc that I live in. And I suppose you could say that these days, perhaps one of the most interesting areas of thought about how we relate to markets is on the psychological level. And there's perhaps no better representation of our psychological appreciation of markets than the world's most famous entrepreneur today. But to find out about him, we're going to have to go to the golf club. What Donald Trump suggests is many things, as we know. But one of them I do remember when he was negotiating with the North Koreans. He said in a press conference that really all he wanted them to do was to have hotels and play golf. And that, I think, is somewhat problematic. At least if you're like me. I don't mind golf, but I don't like it. And I don't particularly want to go to a hotel to play it. It's almost as if the assumption that everybody's going to like the prize that capitalism can offer isn't necessarily right. Perhaps this takes us back to where we started from, or at least where I started from, that little room with the washing up in Plantagenet House. I could see that there was a career available to anybody in Tenby who didn't mind doing a bit of washing up, got quite good at making chili con carne, and then learnt from Bowes how to do excellent trout in butter. Obviously there's more to it than that, but even at the time I thought that really the best I could be in that industry was an interested amateur. It didn't quite switch me on, just as the prospect of endless golf and hotels on link courses actually makes me rather scared. So the assumption behind quite a lot of entrepreneurship that it is inherently good for us is something that I find deeply questionable. I'm sure of this, it's inherently with us and inherently in us, but how we express ourselves through it seems to me to be the crucial point. Now, you may have noticed on this golf course that I just come up to a little bit of a barrier, and I'm going to try and step backwards to illustrate to you what the problem is. That there is a cliff in the sand dunes. It wasn't there when this golf course was made. It's been eroded by the sea as global warming and environmental conditions change, so that this golf course, which appears to be static and everlasting, it won't look like it does today in the future. In fact, it may look a little bit more like a pitch and putt. Perhaps that golf tee behind me, which is where I was just standing, and the way that it's gradually disappearing into the sea here, represents the challenge that entrepreneurship and possibly even capitalism itself faces at the moment. The threats, they come from outside, from the wide blue yonder. This is where the viruses come from that will threaten us in the future. And this big blue thing is currently threatening the coastline all around the UK and everywhere else in the world for that matter. Perhaps the challenges of entrepreneurship today relate to the way we deal creatively and inventively with change being thrust upon us. Today's entrepreneurs are going to have to solve the biggest problems we've ever faced. That's why entrepreneurship education is so important and so interesting.